Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. Well, this is another election-related podcast. This might be my last swing at this ball. As many of you know, I've come out strongly against Donald Trump, and the only way to really do this is to support Hillary Clinton. Now, to say this is a thankless job is an understatement. One of the most alarming things about this election is just how much more energized Trump supporters are. I mean, whenever I come out against Trump and in support of Hillary, no matter how tepid my support of her is, the ratio of criticism to praise is something like 100 to 1. I don't think I'm exaggerating there. And much of this criticism is just absolutely vicious. So I totally understand why many people don't do this. But again, I think Trump is just a terrible human being, while Hillary is merely a compromised one. And the difference is enormous. So I'm committed to doing whatever I can to get this difference across. And if I lose some of you in the process, well, we were probably going to fight about something anyway. Before introducing today's guest, I want to deal with two very common arguments I've heard at this point. The first is that the lesser of two evils is still evil. Now, I don't know where this meme came from, and one hears it mostly from those people who are still threatening to, quote, vote their conscience on Election Day and pick some third-party candidate. Now, there are really two memes here. This is an example of two catchphrases distorting people's thinking. The next president of the United States will either be Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. And if you think that one of them is far worse than the other, your voting for a third-party candidate does absolutely nothing, apart from reduce the margin by which one of them will win the popular vote. If enough people do it, it could swing the election, but not in the direction of the third-party candidate whom your conscience told you to vote for. Okay, so there are two choices here, and they are quite distinct. And I think there's no question that the difference matters. And they are, in certain respects, both bad choices. Okay, but the lesser of two evils is less evil. And it is often much less evil. And when placed alongside true evil, it's the only thing standing between you and it. Right? In that case, the less bad option is like a life preserver thrown to you when you're drowning. It doesn't matter if it's dirty. And that, I would argue, is the situation we are in. And it's the situation we've put the entire world in. So, the lesser of two evils argument is not a fallacy. It's a totally legitimate way to think when you have no truly good, viable option. In fact, it's the only legitimate way to think at that point. Voting for Gary Johnson, who can't get through an interview without mortifying himself, is not sending a message to the system. The only protest vote you should care about sending at this point is that one of these candidates is totally unacceptable. Not merely disappointing, not merely someone you can't be idealistic about, but totally unacceptable. Okay, and the only way to send that message is to vote for the other one. Now, this brings me to the most frequent criticism I've heard. And this is yet another example of a catchphrase of sorts, distorting people's thinking. What I've now heard more times than I can count is some variant of the following. You used to be such a careful thinker, but when you talk about Trump, all you produce are ad hominems. This shows that you're arguing from pure emotion, not reason. Again, I've received that every conceivable way. People have made videos on that point. I've got emails. Every comment thread I've seen has got some version of this. Okay. The ad hominem fallacy. Okay. Ad hominem means to the man. One commits this fallacy when, rather than address an argument or an idea, you merely attack its source. And this technique, if we can call it that, is rightly despised. It's not a valid form of argumentation. For instance, when Donald Trump says that we shouldn't let Muslims into the country because of the risk of terrorism, it is ad hominem to say Donald Trump is a bigot. Full stop. Okay, as though that were an adequate response to the policy argument. Okay, whether or not he's a bigot is irrelevant to the question of whether it's wise or necessary to attempt to keep Muslims out of the country. If you want to argue against that, as I have, you need to say things like it's impractical or it's impossible. Many of these people come from countries in Europe, for instance. Just where and how are you going to apply a religious test to people from England and France and Germany? Or that it's needlessly inflammatory and will prove counterproductive? Or that you'd be keeping out the very allies you need in your fight against extremism? Or that this would violate some deeper value, like the value of helping kids who are being pulverized in a civil war through no fault of their own? Okay, you have to say something that deals with the claim. And so it is with any policy position he or anyone else might articulate. And I've done that. Insofar as Trump has said anything concrete and not immediately self-contradictory about what he intends to do, I have addressed those issues. But what I've mainly been talking about is whether or not Trump should be president. And whether or not he's a bigot is relevant to that question. Many of his qualities as a person, and certainly most of his intellectual and moral qualities, are relevant to that question. So when I say of Trump that he shouldn't be president because he's dangerously uninformed and, even in many respects, unintelligent, and he's a pathological liar, not an ordinary liar, but a liar of a sort you'd expect to meet only in a mental hospital, and that he's a deeply unethical person, one who's actually famous for treating people terribly, and that he's an anti-intellectual, someone who has no respect for real knowledge, much less the life of the mind. Someone, for instance, who could perpetrate a fraud like Trump University and not want to kill himself out of shame. And that he's a sexual predator, not merely married to one. And yes, that he is very likely also a bigot. And that he's above all a bully and a con man, an obvious con man. The most obvious con man I have ever seen in public life. None of this is an example of an ad hominem fallacy. I've argued that giving Donald Trump more responsibility than any person on earth is a bad idea because of who he is, because of the bad qualities he has in spades, and because of the good ones he so obviously lacks. If you're picking a player for a professional basketball team, and a person comes forward demanding to play, and you reject him because he's 4'2" and obese and 85 years old and doesn't seem to know how to play basketball in the first place, that is not an ad hominem fallacy. The person is wrong for the job. Okay? And the fact that he doesn't know it only makes matters worse. Delusion is not an asset. And what I see in Trump is, above all, a bully and a con man. Really the ultimate distillation of what our celebrity-infatuated culture has done to us. He's basically a golem produced by the media, by a century of our giving power, the power of our mere attention to fame. And now he wants to run our country. Now, what I've found over these last few months is that many people who support Trump insist upon interpreting every criticism of him as a mere expression of partisan politics. Now, this should be impossible to do, given that Republicans in droves have echoed even the harshest criticisms I've articulated here. The Wall Street Journal and the National Review have both come out against him. This is unprecedented, and there's a reason for it. And the reason is not merely that people are attached to politics as usual. But what I want to do in this podcast is attempt to reach those of you who view any criticism of Trump as partisan. So I'm going to spend a long time here speaking very critically about the lesser evil, Hillary Clinton, about both Clintons, in fact, because they come as a pair. And I've enlisted Andrew Sullivan to help me in this cause because he certainly knows what's wrong with both Clintons. Most of you know him, of course. Andrew has been a very prominent journalist and editor. He ran the New Republic for many years, and he's written for more or less everybody. He's a frequent political commentator, and the fact that gay marriage is now legal in this country is largely the result of his work. He was also one of the first prominent bloggers, which he did for 15 years at the Daily Dish. He is now a contributing editor at New York Magazine and writes great long-form pieces there. He's published several books, including The Conservative Soul, which I link to on my website. And what we attempt to do in this podcast is sympathize with those of you who hate the Clintons and don't want to see them return to the White House. And now I bring you Andrew Sullivan. So I'm here with Andrew Sullivan. Andrew, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Sam, for having me.
Some of our listeners will be aware of our connection, but for those who aren't, you and I have debated each other twice in print, and the first time was about religion well over a decade ago at this point, and the second was about events in Gaza, and both of those exchanges are on my blog, so people can find them. But one of the great things about our debates, from my point of view, is that they were fairly hard-hitting. I mean, the first one in particular, if I recall, was pretty barbed, or at least I was pretty barbed. And yet, they really became the basis of a friendship. And, I mean, you and I don't see each other that often. We're not in the same city very much, but I certainly consider you a friend. And in my experience, that doesn't happen all that much in public debates. And it's very valuable to me that our communications, while we started out very far apart on certain issues, really were, in the aggregate, totally civil and better than civil. I mean, they really became the basis of a real connection, which is fantastic.
I feel exactly the same way, Sam. I've always, however I disagree with you, I've always respected and enjoyed what you've had to say. And I think for someone with religious faith, I think that your challenges have been important, and certainly not ones that any believer should shrink from. I think that they're things that we should consider and think about, and I'm grateful for it. And I've always detected in you an openness to dialogue above everything else, and that's increasingly, as I get older, the more valuable that is.
Yeah.
So I'm grateful too, and also I must say, as you know, your support for my what I would call my spiritual development. I don't know quite what label you put on it, but you were very helpful for me to understand better what meditation is, and what Buddhism has to offer. Even though I'd had some encounter with it before, your encouragement and your example has definitely helped my life, and I hope helped my thinking process. So I'm grateful.
So yeah, I definitely want to get into that. I really view this conversation as being in two parts, and there's a connection between them. But I want to talk about why it is becoming so difficult, or seemingly so difficult, to communicate effectively on important issues. And the two parts of this conversation, the first is politics, which, as you know, is about as toxic as it has ever been in our lifetime. And the second, I want to talk about what you just alluded to now, is just basically what the internet is doing to us, and this could, in some measure, explain why our politics have become so toxic. And I want to talk about how you stepped away from your online life a while back, and this article you wrote in New York Magazine entitled "I Used to Be a Human Being," which is really a wonderful article, which I'll link to on my blog. Let's get into that and spiritual practice and the kind of contemplative issues you have around, what the internet is doing to the human mind. We'll do that in the second half. And let's start with politics. Maybe just take a moment to describe your political background and leanings so people know where you're coming from.
Well, I grew up in England in the 70s and 80s, and was a Thatcherite. Not only was I a Thatcherite, I must have been. No, I wasn't. Must have been. I actually was the only boy in my high school in England to have a Reagan 80 button. Mm-hmm. And so I really was a sort of member of the right in good standing in the 70s and 80s, and to a great extent the 90s, even though I supported Clinton in 92. at a time when it was possible, I think, to be interested in ideas and arguments about free markets, about the sclerosis of the European welfare state, about government ownership of the economy and direction of the economy. And so was kind of recruited as an up-and-coming right-wing intellectual, as it were. I went to Oxford, where I honed some of those thoughts. But my study at Oxford was in history and French literature. So I wasn't a political major, but I did that in coming to Harvard when I did a PhD in political science at the government department. And my supervisor of my dissertation was Harvey Mansfield, a renowned Straussian, still a renowned Straussian. Amazingly, he seems to have completely avoided any sort of aging. He's done some deal with mortality.
He's got a painting somewhere.
He does have a painting somewhere, but he's a real character. But I wrote my dissertation not on Strauss, but on the English political philosopher, also understood to be a critical influence in 20th century small c conservatism, Michael Oakeshott. And that was my dissertation. So I come from what I still regard myself as an Oakeshottian in that sense, in as much as to have a suspicion of government control, of too big a state sector, a respect for tradition, for how a society evolves organically, for pragmatism in politics, and for skepticism in intellectual life. And my dissertation was actually upon an implicit esoteric religious doctrine in Michael Oakeshott. So that's where I came from. And then going into America, I supported Reagan in 84, supported Bush in 88, but supported Clinton in 92 on the grounds that while I do believe that it was important to correct for some of the overreach of the left in the 70s and 80s, my core commitment is to a civilized and open society. And that requires two parties that share in the responsibilities of government and take turns in power in order to correct the abuses and difficulties and overreach of each other. And so it's important for me as a small c conservative that, for example, the Democratic Party come back to the center and regain power. This is the moment when really my first drift from the right began. The idea that I could support Clinton over Bush and Perot on the grounds that he was more in touch with in 92 an emerging culture and society that was more diverse, more forward-looking, younger, and obviously on the question of gay rights, at least before he was elected, a relatively hopeful and different position. And so I think I placed myself in that sort of liberal Republican / conservative Democrat mold. And when I edited the New Republic from 91 to 96, I was definitely regarded as a conservative influence on that magazine, even though that magazine was at that point a kind of blend of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. I also defended that magazine's core liberal ethos, even though I didn't fully share it. Because again, I felt a responsibility to that institution within American politics and culture. So then I went on, excuse me if I'm going on too long, just to my trajectory. I found Clinton by 96 to be so ethically and morally despicable that I actually supported Bob Dole in 96. On the grounds that I actually believe that given his conduct in office so far, that it was simply a matter of time before Clinton sabotaged himself and the country, which turned out to be, unfortunately, true. In 2000, I was really up in the air. I had a great deal of respect for Al Gore, but I liked at least candidate George W. Bush. I liked the humble foreign policy. I liked the compassionate conservatism to some extent. I liked the ability to reach out to demographic groups that had not been properly part of the Republican coalition, primarily Latino voters, and thought between a moderate right candidate and a moderate left one, I didn't see a big problem with the moderate right one. It turns out, of course, that I was completely mistaken about that. And I think in the partisan and polarizing moment after 9/11, I kind of went off the deep end and supported the war and supported Bush, largely out of a horror at what Islamist fundamentalism was threatening against core Western values and the mass murder that they were perpetrating in the name of fundamentalist religion. I'm also, I should say, but just to fill in people, Roman Catholic. I still practice, but grew increasingly concerned with also the trend towards fundamentalism of a different kind within the Catholic Church under Benedict XVI and to some extent John Paul II. Anyway, I'm just trying to give you a brief overview. But then I turned against Bush and the Republicans because of what I saw as an inability to effectively conduct a war and to effectively realize that they had made a terrible error. For me, the fundamental issue in that conflict was the use of torture by the United States, which I found to be a step to take us outside of civilizational boundaries. And also a period of time where I felt the Constitution was essentially in abeyance. And I was so repelled by that that I supported a man I really didn't like very much, John Kerry, in 2004, and then came to see Obama as actually what I believed to be the moderate center-right president that I'd always wanted, but even more thrillingly, able to bring African Americans more fully into that center and into American public life.
Yeah. So I have an agenda for this part of the conversation that I want to make explicit for our listeners because, I've said many terrible things about Trump on this podcast, and I'm sure I will say some terrible things today, but this has revealed some very disconcerting things to me about my audience and about just the possibilities of communication. The first is that there's just the fact that there's a significant number of people who follow me who are Trump supporters and who are amazed that I'm not one too. And I can only assume that this has something to do with how hard I've been on Islam over the years. But I continually hear from people who claim to have loved my work and to have read my books, but now have lost all respect for me because I'm voting for Hillary Clinton. And, one person just wrote saying, it's too bad Hitch died when it should have been you, right? I mean, so these communications are very pointed.
Yeah.
And the most annoying thing about that one is, honestly, the fact that this person is certain that Hitch would have voted for Trump, right? Now, I mean, we can talk about that. I've talked about that on the podcast. Even with all that Hitch wrote about the Clintons, I think there's absolutely no way he would have voted for Trump. But the problem is that no matter how clearly I spell out what is wrong with Trump and describe my endorsement of Clinton as the lesser evil, right? I'm accused of being rankly partisan and totally dishonest and of ignoring all that's wrong with Clinton. And this really bothers me because, there really is, insofar as I can know my own mind, there is absolutely nothing partisan about my endorsement of Clinton. I could easily imagine a Republican who I would vote for over her. And there's just not much you would have to change about this, generic Republican so as to make me vote for him or her over Clinton. I saw your most recent appearance on Real Time talking about Clinton and Trump, and given your background and given that you're in touch with what has been wrong with our system and the way in which the Clintons in many ways crystallize what's wrong with our system, it seems that you could be the perfect person to help me try to bridge this gap. Because what I want us to do is to talk honestly about what's wrong with the Clintons, to give it as sympathetic a view as possible of why people hate them with such passion and why people hate the system of which they are a very clear expression, and then make the case why none of that matters in the current election. Because people are just missing just how terrifyingly unqualified Trump is, and on every conceivable level. And they're not only missing it, they're missing how clear this is, right? I mean, this is unmissable. So in any case, you and I are speaking on the morning after the third presidential debate, where the evidence of the difference between Clinton and Trump was not in short supply. So let's just start with the issue with the Clinton. I mean, so why did you break ranks with Bill Clinton, and give me a sympathetic view of why someone would not be happy to see the Clintons back in the White House?
Oh, where do I start, really? I mean, they're about the pursuit of power by almost any constitutional means possible. There's a lack of integrity to both of them, it seems to me. I witnessed this firsthand. I was editor of the New Republic when Clinton first became president, and the New Republic was, under my editorship, actually championed the Clinton candidacy, one of the first. Sidney Blumenthal, may God forgive me, was my campaign correspondent in '92. And you saw with Sidney, when I actually caught him faxing pieces to Hillary in advance of their publication to check that he'd got every single spin right, again shows just who these people are. They're operators. They're at the center of a web of, we used to call it Clincest, of friends and colleagues dedicated to the advancement of each other. They are money grubbers. They are liars. And I, for one, for example, in the early 90s, was one of the first advocates of marriage equality and for military service for gay people. And to watch them kill us in that period and treat gay people with complete contempt, and then to portray themselves as pioneers of gay civil rights, the sheer chutzpah of these people when they were actually not just against marriage equality, they did everything in their power to kill off the movement for marriage equality. And I know because I was, in one ways, one of 4 people in that movement at the beginning.
Did you ever hear Hillary Clinton on Fresh Air with Terry Gross trying not to admit that her opinion on marriage equality had changed for about 10 minutes and getting more and more defensive?
Well, that's part of what drives you crazy about them, is their refusal to tell the truth even about themselves, the constant spinning, the constant refusal to really be accountable. And this also goes to Bill Clinton's history of sexual assault. One of the things I'm proudest of at the New Republic was running an editorial defending Paula Jones's right to have a say in court, which was greeted by the Democratic left as an act of treason. The way in which honest alleged feminists were prepared to sacrifice every single principle they ever had to advance this man who was essentially one of the most horrendous offenders in dealing with women sexually, just staggered me at the time. And Hillary Clinton, of course, in full knowledge of her husband's history of sexual assault and harassment, went to town in defending him and trashing those women. All of that the Trump campaign has re-aired is true. I absolutely believe is true.
Actually, one question there, because I'm not as familiar with the history as I might be. I certainly haven't waded through all the relevant biographies, but many people think that Hillary was legitimately deceived by Bill on many of these points, and certainly, let's say, the Lewinsky scandal, that she had bought his lie that nothing had happened, and you could sort of see her reaction to the truth emerging, kind of play out in real time between them.
I think that's absolutely true with Lewinsky.
Okay.
It's not true with Jennifer Flowers. It's not true with Paula Jones. It's not true with Juanita Broderick. It's not true with Kathleen Willey. I mean, and others who are beginning to come forward. I think to say that Hillary Clinton was not aware of her husband's a tendency for sexual assault and objectification and demeaning and degrading treatment of women is really not to do her justice.
Mm.
She's a grown person. She sat for 60 minutes in 92, brazenly lying about her husband's affair with Jennifer Flowers. Almost everyone around her acknowledges this. And yet she's stuck with her husband. And not only this, but at the very beginning, this pioneer of feminism decided that her career could only really get off the ground if she married an up-and-coming governor and hitched her wagon to his. This is not what Margaret Thatcher did. It's not what Theresa May did. It's not what Angela Merkel did. It's not what many pioneering women in politics have done. Which is why I think it sticks in the craw to see her, and why so many people have not been able to embrace her as the first potential woman president. However much we might want to see a woman become president, somehow the wife of a former president who trashed women on the way up and who herself never did the feminist thing and pioneered her own career and her own life in politics, is actually not a great feminist icon at all. And always arguing that whatever we do, however we behave, we are so much part of the greater good, and the Republicans are always so evil that anything we do is justified.
Do you think you're being, or possibly being, too cynical here on a few points? So, for instance, what about the possibility that Hillary stuck by Bill through all of this and obviously got married in the first place to him, not based on some Machiavellian political scheming, but just this is the person she's in love with. She has accepted his flaws in a way that may harken back to another generation, Mad Men style. And she was just all in with him and realized that in some purely pragmatic and obviously not honest way, since they're on the right side of history on most of these issues, since they have the right goals for the country, this is how the sausage gets made. You got to get on 60 Minutes and lie about this meaningless affair that you don't care about, and you're the wife, you're the one who's supposed to care, or you're the only one who needs to care if caring is called for. And you have to lie because this is going to torpedo your political career and your husband's, and it matters because the other side is wrong on issues of consequence for millions of people. Is there a way to sympathize with her in that moment, or is she still a bit of a monster even then?
Of course, everybody's a human being, and I don't doubt that she did fall in love with Bill Clinton. But at the same time, I think it would be naive to believe that their marriage was entirely about love. It was also a political partnership, and in which she used that partnership to gain political power in a way that I think was fundamentally illegitimate in the first Clinton administration. We elect one president. We didn't elect two. If we had elected two presidents or a co-president, she would be ineligible to run right now. But she wanted her cake and eat it too. She wants to be, the advocate of a clean system in government and against campaign finance abuses. But there she is, making millions of dollars in ways she didn't need to, of very many banks, of many entities, and many foreign governments that are just despicable. You can't, there's plenty of ways to excuse what they did and to justify it. And they provided those excuses and justifications. And in many cases, as I said, I supported Clinton in 92. But over the long run, these things do change you. That if you sacrifice your integrity repeatedly, even if every single time for a little bit, it might be in your mind justified, the cumulative effect of this is to render you incapable of taking any principled or moral position. And be seen to be doing so. People, when they say they don't trust her, I think most people have watched closely, and they know that yes, she will switch around, she will change, she will be pragmatic around principle in a way that cumulatively gets to be disturbing. And I think that's the point. No politician is, Martin Luther King Jr. They're not. We have to accept that. But there's something particularly sustained and merciless about her sacrifice of principles in pursuit of power. And I think to be skeptical about that, and also to believe that that kind of figure can never actually reach people and persuade them in moments of difficulty or crisis that there's someone that they can look to, there's someone they can trust. She still doesn't have that. She doesn't have that with the American people. She's still unable in a crisis, I think, if she were president, to actually sit down and really be the president of all the people in a way, for example, that Barack Obama could and did, however hostile people are to him. He did have that connection. People do actually think of him as having integrity because he actually does have integrity. Now, he's a hard act to match, and that's why he beat her. But here again, you've been in the White House for 2 terms as First Lady. You've been Secretary of State. You lost your major attempt to win. What do you do? What you do in her case was to try and prevent any rising star in the Democratic Party from ever challenging her, holding on so that it's her turn, holding the entire party hostage to her own fortunes, squelching possible new blood in order to get another term in the center of power. And at some point, look, I don't want to saint, but there was something consistent about this. And it's typified, for example, by her, claiming to be an avatar of gay rights while her husband signed the Defense of Marriage Act, doubled the number of people discharged from the military. And then, crucially, I'll give you 2 examples. One, ran advertisements in the South touting in 96 his exclusion of gay people from marriage equality. And subsequently, and I'll tell you this, when I went in, I was testifying in Congress for the Defense of Marriage Act, and we were ready to go in and make our case. That very morning, the Clinton Justice Department put out a completely unnecessary guidance that they believed that the Defense of Marriage Act had no constitutional problems whatsoever. Just to kick us in the gut, to kill off this movement because it might threaten, they believed, their re-election prospects. And I think, to be honest, I'd be straightforward, it's the personal experience of this, to be personally lied to be told, as I was personally told by George Stephanopoulos, that they would, in Don't Ask, Don't Tell, completely ensure that no one was subsequently fired. And yet they doubled the discharges from the military and did nothing about it. And to sign the Defense of Marriage Act, for Bill Clinton to do that while he's making a mockery of marriage in the White House, at some point, you just have to say, there's something about these people. There is something about these people that is not trustworthy. There's something about these people that in the end will defend themselves against any principle. And I admire a certain grittiness in politics, and I certainly understand why you have to make compromises. There's something about the relentless willingness to sacrifice any core principles that they have that has rightly made us, many of us, deeply skeptical of them. I also think, just leave the moral and ethical question, I just don't think she's been that good in public life. I just don't think she's not just a very good politician, which now even her supporters acknowledge, and as a candidate, a terribly weak candidate in many respects, but not very good in government. When you ask her what has she done in 30 years, she doesn't really have a good argument. She has one good argument, I think, which is the S-chip program, which really did give children greater health security, health insurance options than they had before, which I don't want to dismiss in any way. That's a huge achievement on her part. But that's about it. She also, by bungling healthcare reform in the first term of the Clinton administration, made expanding health insurance of people less likely for another 20 years. As Secretary of State, she supported, the only ways you can see her actual input, she supported Libyan intervention, which, if you've supported the Iraq War and say you've learned the lessons, which is the best way to think of what she said, although she's took a hell of a long time admitting it, and only admitted it when it would help her politically, one points out. But then to admit that you did something stupid by deciding that you're going to remove a dictator in a Middle East country without planning for the aftermath, and then do it entirely one more time when you're Secretary of State, creating chaos in Libya.
Right. Although many people have pointed out that there was at least one relevant difference there, which is that you had a significant popular uprising calling for intervention in Libya, which you didn't have in Iraq.
Well, you did. I mean, the Shia were constantly, and the Kurds were constantly asking for intervention, begging for it.
I think even now, America's intervention in Libya is still popular I mean, it's like 70% of Libyans think that it was a good thing.
That it is a chaotic situation
Yeah, no
where
doubt.
ISIS has gained ground. Um, I think there was bad judgment on her part, and I think it's one of the greatest mistakes. And even now, she is attempting to get us militarily involved in Syria. She's learned very little from her own mistakes, and I think it's very hard. And I think you could see it in the debates for her to actually defend her record, to point
Yeah.
anything that really she made a difference that wasn't itself disastrous.
Well, there were a couple of great moments last night in the debate. There were two moments where I was really flabbergasted that he let her get away with these moments, and that Chris Wallace did as well. The one where he asked her whether she would give back the $20 or $25 million that the Clinton Foundation had taken from the Saudis, and that just he just kept talking there and didn't give her any space to reply, and then she never had to reply to that. And also, she didn't address at all his claims about Bill Clinton's sexual indiscretions. But you could see in those moments how compromised she is ethically, in that she really has to walk on eggshells there. She can't just give a straightforward defense of what he's pointing to there, and she just has to hope that nobody notices and the topic changes.
This is an election which, weirdly enough, became a core issue of sexual assault, the way men treat women. And she's the first woman candidate, the president, and she's barely been able to say a single thing about it.
Yeah, it's really excruciating.
Because of her being, and she recognizes this, utterly morally compromised on the question. She's also utterly compromised by telling all sorts of private audiences that she believes in open borders when she's now advocating to fend off Trump's attacks, that she's actually tough on border security. The rhetoric she's using to a particular group, which she then did everything she could to prevent being aired, precisely because she worried about the discrepancy, at least in the rhetoric, between her private rhetoric and her public rhetoric, is disconcerting. There is, and the rhetoric she gives to the bankers when she's inside and when she's talking about reining them in on the outside. You know, there's only, again, one instance of this might be one thing you can slough up, but this is a lifetime of doing this. And the other thing I would say is her offhand remarks when she's caught privately. So, for example, in these fundraisers, these gay fundraisers, by the way, where she calls millions of people irredeemable in an election. Now, not only just pragmatically, I think that is stupid, but it's the attitude, the condescension, the dismissal of lots of people. But no one's irredeemable.
Well, I think there are people who are, I mean, just judging from my communications online and in my inbox, I think there are people who are irredeemable for all practical purposes in terms of getting them to understand what's true in the world. I was just talking to Peter Singer on a previous podcast. You know, I hear from people who claim that the Sandy Hook massacre was a hoax engineered by the Obama administration to justify him coming to take our guns. Right?
But to say that half of his supporters are in this category, which he then had to walk back, and she withdrew and retracted what she said. You see, I think what the Clintons really don't fundamentally believe in the American people. They think the American people cannot really adjust or accept the arguments that they really want to make. They think they're bigots and racists, Neanderthals that have to be lied to in order to get your way.
We're going to get there.
Even though I have no illusions at all about what a wretched example of the worst kind of corruption in politics. I don't mean, well, not the worst kind, but a kind of low-level, systemic, liberal condescension and arrogance, as well as money-grubbing corruption.
This is what mystifies me. I mean, whose vote is she afraid to lose if she speaks more honestly about Islam and Islamism and the spread of jihadism and the Saudis' role in doing that, and the necessity to achieve energy security in light of the Saudis' role? I mean, why can't she speak basic human sanity on this point?
Because it would give her some political liabilities as president with respect to the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, which she wants to keep open. She characterologically can't take a clear moral stance on these questions and be completely frank. That's what people say when they don't trust her. They can feel there's an obvious answer to this, but she can't do it. Like, for example, on border security, she actually, if she wanted to go at Trump and say, look, I'm in favor of tough border security. I believe in that. I voted for many things that beefed up the border. I mean, this metaphor of the wall is one thing, but yes, she did support the wall. Why can't she forthrightly say that? Because she then worries, well, that will alienate some Latinos that I have to keep on my side. She couldn't make a distinction in the convention between legal and illegal immigrants, which is a crucial distinction, one of the things that Trump has been able to use because she doesn't want to offend this constituency. It's always calculation. And it's always caution, and that's what drives you crazy about them after a while. They can't say what they know. They refuse to be that clear about it. And she's worse even than her husband. And it's that constant hedging, that constant abandoning any sort of conviction. So, for example, on Obamacare, she could not say, which she should say, what we have to do to make this work is to beef up the individual mandate, to make sure more healthy people are brought into this system. And the government's going to have to do that to make this work. She won't do that because that would possibly alienate some people, and so she won't. Doesn't want to alienate the Saudi government. She doesn't want to alienate any supporters. And so we end up in this sort of calculative muddle in the middle where people don't trust her.
That one of the things that is odious about her is that she believes you have to have a public and private conversation, which are distinct, because the people can't handle the truth. There's so little appetite or ability for honest reasoning that people will seize upon your words, like the way she was using the phrase open borders in context, as opposed to the way that those words can be made to seem, and you'll never become president, or you'll never achieve the office you're seeking because people are stupid and cynical, and the truth will be used against you. So you have to focus group everything.
Compare that with Barack Obama. He's not that way. He actually did articulate what he wanted to do in his speeches, in his State of the Union addresses. He was very clear about what he tried to do. He was very honest.
Although we don't have his private email communication from his campaign. So
no, but we do know that he had confidence not in lying to the American people about who he was, what he wanted to do. And he won 2 elections, and he is, ending with an approval rating that's similar to Reagan's. I think the Clintons give up before they even start.
Yeah.
And I think they've learned this from being hazed, essentially, and coming of that generation of Democrats who, especially during Reagan and Bush, really believed that the American people did not agree with them. And therefore, the only way to advance themselves was to do all this stuff on the hush-hush. I saw this particularly with gay rights, where they refused to make strong, clear arguments for why this mattered. Some of us were out there trying to make the substantive arguments, believing if we made those substantive arguments, the American people would come along. And you know what? They did. A third of the American people changed their mind over 15 years. Yeah. Because we didn't adhere to this idea that the American people are essentially a bunch of idiots and also bigots, that you have to, in order to advance reasonable goals, you have to somehow dissemble because the people can't be trusted. That is where they come from. They come from the view that no one really agrees with them, but they have to do this by stealth. And they have to have one conversation inside the tent and another conversation out.
Yeah.
Now, that is not what Barack Obama has done or has said. And he's been more successful.
But actually, in defense of Clinton or to impugn Obama as well, he's done it really in the identical way she has on the topic of Islam and jihadism. This lie that Islam is a religion of peace that has nothing to do with terrorism, and that ISIS is not Islamic. And I mean, I've talked about this on the podcast many times, that there certainly is a rationale for that lie. And it may in fact be true that it is politically prudent or just geopolitically prudent to lie in this way, but it is a lie, and everyone knows it's a lie, and the experience of being lied to on that point, especially in the immediate aftermath of some terrorist atrocity, is so galling.
The
And
difference is that Obama has explained candidly why he won't say, for example, radical jihadist terrorism, because he thinks it will make it harder to defeat radical jihadist terrorism. Now, you can agree or disagree with that,
right,
but he said that
yeah, but
he's simply
just
just as
at the 11th hour,
Obama's
it'd be being pushed. I mean, for after years of, I mean, he said it in a way. I mean, I found his defense of the way he talks about this fairly infuriating because it was a really bullying, hectoring, sanctimonious attack on people who just want an honest discussion of the issues. And I mean, I certainly can argue that we would empower the moderate Muslims and the reformers in the Muslim world much more if we just had an honest discussion about the civil war that's occurring in the Muslim world.
I'm with you, Sam. You know I'm with you on this.
Yeah.
I do think that the role that you and I have is different than the role of a president running a war.
Yes, I've certainly acknowledged that as well.
And
Yeah.
there are in wartime, there are some things that you don't want to give the enemy a propaganda advantage.
But the other problem is that it has, at least from my perspective, given us Trump. Obviously, there are other reasons as well, but it is one of the main ones that has brought Trump to the very threshold of the Oval Office. Because,
Yes.
I mean, I'm hearing it is the most common thing I hear, and again, I get a fair amount of this from my erstwhile readers and listeners. There are many single-issue voters out there, and the issue is Islam, terrorism, immigration, insofar as we're talking about Syrian refugees coming in who are going to be jihadists or Islamists. It's a single issue. These are not people who are worried about Latinos coming to pick our fruit. They're worried about what they see in Europe. I mean, the migrant crisis in Europe is a disaster. I mean, as much as your heart breaks for the people who are coming out of the hellhole of Syria, who you would just want to help and who are never going to become jihadists, what is happening in Europe is really horrible for...
It's horrifying, and Merkel, bears a huge amount of responsibility for that. And I think, for example, some of that is precisely why the UK left the EU. Well, left, but voted that way. So I agree with you. However, the United States is not Europe. It's not absorbing 1 million. It's absorbed almost no one. So, I mean, comparatively, very few from Syria. We have 2 vast oceans. But yeah, I do think that not addressing this from a really constructive, clear-minded, and positive way does allow someone like Trump to gain credibility because people want to hear someone telling the truth.
Yeah.
Just as it's important that it's true that many people are in this country, especially those without degrees, do have their wages depressed by mass immigration, especially immigration that is not in any way legal or documented, and that's a completely legitimate question. And when he says we're either a country or we're not a country, he's right.
Don't you think there's something a little more sympathetic we can say about her at that point, though, where it's not just that she has no principles, it's just that there is, I mean, to take the foundation as the narrow case, she will take money from even odious people because she actually knows she can do good with it. And her heart is in the right place insofar as what she wants to get done in the world. I mean, if she had all the power, what do you think the world would look like? It would not be a world of shocking inequality and children, working, in sweatshops. It would be a world very much like the one you hope to have realized at some point. It's not that her heart's in the wrong place on these issues. And for something like her foundation, yeah, why not take the Saudi money and use it to deal with the AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa?
The one thing I don't like is the personal money grubbing.
Oh, you mean so just the personal enrichment through speeches?
The personal enrichment through speeches to people and organizations and regimes that are really disgusting.
Right.
You don't have to do that. It doesn't advance any broader social good. It just makes you money.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and Bill Clinton has been especially egregious there. I mean,
Oh,
do you know the stories of him asking to give speeches? I forget which regimes they were, but obviously the wrong ones. With terrible human rights records, he wanted to give his $400,000 keynote somewhere and sent something like 3 appeals to the State Department to get this okayed, and they kept denying it. Like, this is not good. The optics are all wrong here. And he just wouldn't take no for an answer. I mean, just like
no.
the next $400,000, even when you've made whatever it was, 48 million in a period of 4 years on your speeches, it's just he's just got to grab that extra check. I mean, these people have never seen a check they didn't like.
No, and it seems as if they can't just be well off. They have to be extremely well off. They have to hobnob with some of the most wealthy individuals in the world, and they want to compete with those people and be in that league. Again, look, we're all human. We're not electing saints, but there's something unseemly about their money grubbing and their ability to accept massive conflicts of interest in order to enrich themselves. There is something
Yeah.
unseemly about this.
I forget the name of the charity, but you remember that model who was hit in the Asian tsunami and who's, I think, lost her boyfriend or fiance, and then she started a charity, I think, for Indonesian relief, tsunami relief. And this got a fair amount of press at one point, and they held a fundraiser for her charity, and I think it raised like $1 million, and Clinton was the keynote. But then it comes out that he charged $500,000 for his keynote.
You bet he did.
So, I mean, it would
Defend
never.
that, Sam.
It's like he's already, and maybe this money went to the Clinton Foundation. Let's say that's the best case scenario, but he's already fantastically wealthy. He's ostensibly supporting this charity that's just struggling to be born, right? And all he has to do is show up and give his speech. I'm sure he didn't even have to travel for it. And he takes fully half of the money raised. That tells me like everything I need to know about him. It would never
Yeah.
occur to me to do that. I mean, if I am speaking, like in a couple of weeks, I'm going to speak with Richard Dawkins at a benefit for the Center for Inquiry and the Richard Dawkins Foundation. It would never occur to me to ask to be paid to do that. It's like it's like, let's get every last dime, no matter what you get off these people, and it really is.
Yeah, there's an extremity to them.
Yeah.
I mean, that takes even if I were to concede the point that ex-presidents should be able to make a huge amount of money off private speaking to private groups. There is simply a degree with which they are. Let's put it. They are money grubbing in a way that really does leave one's jaw open sometimes. Yeah. I mean, that's all I'm saying. And you look at someone like Jimmy Carter, who has behaved in such an exemplary fashion, or even George H.W. Bush. And I think those things matter in a republic. I think one of the reasons our democracy is in such terrible straits, and the reason that people are so cynical about it, is because they see these public officials trying to use public office for their own personal enrichment. And that is, it may be in any individual case defensible, but collectively and politically, it tarnishes our system. It adds to the cynicism.
Well, the revolving door that people talk about is obviously corrupting, where you have senators who become lobbyists, who become senators, who become lobbyists. I mean, that opportunism and cronyism
this is where populism does gain a foothold. You see, I mean,
yeah.
I live in Washington D.C. and I've lived here for 25 years, and the amount of money that has come into this city. I mean, it's great for those of us who live here. If we already bought property, which I did 25 years ago. But at the same time, it just feels like just a hideous incrustation of low-level corruption that I think has helped and aided and abetted the kind of populism that Trump has harnessed.
Yeah.
And I do think unless the elites begin to exercise some sense of civic responsibility. When I see someone like Leslie Moonves, for example, of CBS saying, Donald Trump may be terrible for America, but he's been great for CBS. I mean, at some level, screw you. I mean, really, you're a disgrace. Are you a citizen, or are you a parasite? Similarly, the way that Jeff Zucker is only now saying, well, maybe we shouldn't have opened the spigots and let him have his rallies live on CNN for hours on end, day after day. But it made us a lot of money. I mean, at some level, when people see the elites behaving in this way, they have every reason to despise them. When they see the elites who have, for example, conducted and supported a war that was a disaster, and no one has really been held accountable in any core way for it. When they see the financial elites screw up massively, and in such a way that they plunge millions of people into poverty and economic insecurity for decades, and still demand the same amounts of remuneration. In fact, they're earning more now than they did before. At some point, these things will count, and they will destabilize the entire system that we believe in. Trump is right. The elites in this country deserve a shellacking. And my view is that the only way forward is if elites begin in this country to start treating their responsibilities as members of this republic seriously. They're citizens, not just money makers. And I wrote a piece about Plato and his analysis of how a tyrant emerges out of democracy. And one of the crucial conditions for Plato is that the ruling elite becomes more interested in money than they do in the survival of their own republic. And those conditions are absolutely in place. And that's an absolutely classic example where one of the members of the elite with lots of money says, I am going to call out the other members of the elite, and I am going to represent you. Right. And I am going to expose them. And there's an element in which Trump has exposed the bankruptcy of Republican and Democratic neoconservative foreign policy. He's exposed the bankruptcy of a globalist economic policy that has no concern whatsoever for many people in this country who smell the condescension and who rightly are repelled by it. And my view is that if the elites don't hear this and don't adjust their own behavior, make some bloody sacrifices, then Trump is just the beginning of a populist radical movement that threatens the entire country. Similarly, if the elites don't understand the danger this kind of income inequality will do to a democracy, then they're going to lose that democracy and they're going to lose their free markets.
I share the view that wealth inequality is a huge problem. And when I wrote about it, sometime around the time of the financial collapse, I was amazed at the vitriol that I got back in defense of no ethical concern at all around wealth inequality. I mean, just people, and this was, I'm sure these were not especially wealthy people attacking me. There's this very strange religion of the self-made person in America,
and
where
look, in general, I'm very sympathetic to that view. But look, when that leads to a situation, and it hasn't always happened. There have been many situations in which this hasn't happened, in which the ability to earn lots of money has been great for everybody. But when a combination of globalized economics, the massively increased benefits to people who are smart in this economy, the massive sorting and sifting of the population, in which large numbers of able people are moving into super zip codes, in which we've created this bubble that is essentially exploitative of the rest of the country, then you're in real danger of tipping the entire system upside down. I think conservatives of all people, conservatives who want to conserve our free market system and our democratic system, need to be more concerned than anybody else about this kind of wealth and income inequality, because it will destabilize and delegitimize the entire system. And what we're living in right now is clearly a moment in which the entire system is illegitimate. And I think we need to get real about that.
Yeah. Well, also the way that technology is of necessity dragging us into a future, which could be a very good future if we play our cards right, where there are jobs that are disappearing that are never coming back, and they're not going to be replaced by new jobs.
And people know this. They're not fools. They're living they're living in a way that people like you and me are not living in some ways, on the edge of this abyss.
Yeah.
They can see their futures disappearing.
I
And
mean,
it's not because they're
just this morning, Tesla just released a video of the next generation of cars. So this is literally a car that's available now, right? That is fully autonomous. So that, I mean, you see this car leave the garage, drive on side streets, stop at stop signs, avoid pedestrians, recognize red lights versus green lights, drop its occupant off at an office at Tesla, and then go find an empty parking space. Driverless cars are here.
And what they're going to do, when you look at white working class men in this country, so many of them are involved in driving things.
Yeah. It's the most common profession, apparently,
Yeah,
for white men in this country.
And the truth is that people look at the elites and say, who's really worried about this? Who there is really listening to us? And the truth is almost no one is. I mean, you think, I take NAFTA. NAFTA I supported, and I think in general it has been a good thing. But that it has had extraordinarily disparate impact in this country, that some populations have lost leverage, clout, and income because of it is undeniable. And the fact that these economists didn't really predict that, and if so far as they did predict it, didn't really take it that seriously. Well, they would have if it were their jobs. And I think the isolation increasingly of the elites and the distance between them and most people in this country has led people to feel there's no one who can represent their voice there, that no one represents their interests. And I think it's incredibly important that they hear that this is something that is concerned, which is so that even though you could make an argument for, say, TPP, you have to acknowledge that politically and socially, this country it may be not able to absorb this kind of rapid change, that may need to slow it down for the sake of our social stability, for the sake of our political integrity. And that's what you're seeing in Britain, for example, where Brexit happened. And this was a genuine feel that the elites in this country are doing things with no regard for many of their fellow citizens. That's pushed Britain into an existential crisis at this point. And I think we ignore those trends at our peril. We have to figure out how to address them. The paradox is, of course, we don't know how to address this question. We don't currently have an answer to this problem.
Well, one, to take the point I just raised about the progress of technology, I mean, clearly, at a certain point, once we arrive at the actual end of human drudgery. I mean, when you have self-driving cars, and not only is there no need for ape-driven cars, you would have to be irresponsible to let an ape drive a car because they're so much worse at it, right? It'll be illegal to drive your own car, and it should be, because right now 30,000 people or 35,000 people die every year reliably because of how bad we are at driving cars. So at a certain point, the machines are going to steal jobs that aren't coming back, and we have to break this connection, this pseudo-ethical connection between work and having a claim on your own survival in society, right? So the idea that if you don't work, you shouldn't be able to eat, which is where a lot of people, ironically, a lot of the people who would vote for Trump or who will vote for Trump are people who look across the way at their shiftless neighbor and think, if you don't work for it, you don't deserve anything. I don't want any of my tax dollars going to support your shiftless lifestyle. Well, at a certain point, I mean, that's an understandable way of thinking, but at a certain point, we will arrive in a world where, again, only if we play our cards right, we will arrive in a world where there's so much wealth and so much automation of boring jobs that there will not be enough productive things to do, and we'll be left with just creative and fun things to do, and people will still have to be paid for that.
No, the trouble is that not everybody's capable of being creative.
So you need a universal basic income, or you need something you need a safety net that gets better and better and better the more wealth gets created.
The deeper problem, Sam, is that work makes people happy. It gives them meaning. It makes them feel productive. It makes them feel as if they're worth something.
So then we need a cultural renaissance that values that very principle of mastering some craft, getting good at it, and doing it. But ultimately we will have to break the connection between doing that and surviving, because there's no need. I mean,
Yes.
the alternative is
Yes.
just wealth inequality of a sort we have never witnessed before.
Yes. But that's going to be certainly within the Protestant work ethic of the United States, going to be a huge
Yeah.
cultural and psychological shift that I'm not sure we're capable of achieving. And you see in these communities around the country, first of all, you see a dropping labor force participation by working age men all over the place. And working age young men who have nothing to do except go on video games is not a good thing for the society as a whole. It decouples also marriage and taking care of kids as something that you can take pride in because you are the provider. And again, we're talking about people's psyches here. We're not talking about simply economics. And I worry about this. I also worry about, and here we will disagree, about the collapse of real religious communities around the country and traditional religion, because that did give people meaning and direction, just as the idea of the nation gives people meaning and connection. And, Marx said religion is the opiate of the people, but you know what? These days, opiates are the opiate of the people. And at some level, unless you have a cultural shift in which people can have meaning in their lives, have self-worth, that's not going to be simply about surviving, but about something else, then you're going to have a psychological and social problem that's going to get worse and worse. And we're seeing now patterns of behavior and patterns of family life in rural America that's very closely correlated with some of the more disastrous patterns in the past and currently in the present in inner cities in this country. And this is a huge problem. I agree. I think a universal basic income is probably one way to go, but it's just the beginning. It's not the end of this. And it's incredibly hard. And no one is really talking about this, and yet people are deeply anxious about it. And I think that's the discrepancy between, when you look at this country right now, it's doing really, really well, actually. Certainly if you compare it to any other advanced economy, the United States is the country you would bet on. And yet its people are clearly, large numbers of its people are deeply unhappy and lost and bewildered. And I think that my hope is that if we get the election result, it looks like we may get, it could be there might be a way to turn this around. There might be a way to see in this the beginning of a new kind of America that sees what it nearly did and never, ever goes back there again.
Maybe so. And listen, Andrew, it's been great talking to you. I love talking to you.
Yeah, this is fun. We went on forever, Sam.
Yeah.
I'm so worried.